homeowner is in charge to recover some rent from the attaching entities. The other directly recoverable costs are the other recoverable costs have to do with the costs of the administrative costs of taking in an application and processing that application for a party to attach, the field inspections that are required to pre-survey and or perform engineering work, pole replacements, the cost of pole replacements to create additional capacity for attachments, in some cases rearrangement. So there are a finite number of things that a pole owner can recover costs for. They're recovering the costs of doing the work necessary to provide access and space on the pole. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So I have this slide called typical joint use attachments. They're not all here, but I wanted you to get a sense of the different types of things you might see on a pole, particularly if you've not really paid attention to these before. This is a pole, much older pole in an older neighborhood in Portland. You can see up at the very top, you have the electric utility conductors, you have a street light, and then as you move down the pole, you have a fiber attachment, and this is one way that fiber is attached to a pole. It's an attachment with a rubber grommet to protect the fiber from being damaged. Fiber storage is a snowshoe. Fiber is stored in these snowshoes. Typical cable TV attachment. Here, telephone company attachment. Other cable equipment. So when you're driving around or walking around, I don't recommend looking at that. Walking around, look up, you can see these types of attachments. And here's an example of, the power company's on, the phone company's on, the cables company is on, and one other telecommunications provider is on. So that's a classic example of joint use. What you don't see there is some other equipment like transformers or cross arms, but those are quite common as well. Question? Well, we're certainly starting to see small cells. So, for the benefit of the folks in the room, small cell is a kind of a scaled down version of wireless equipment that helps with infill for the wireless companies. For example, a macro cell site, the big towers that you see with the cells on top, my understanding is they have, in some cases, maybe a 3-mile range, whereas a small cell maybe has 300 foot, maybe 1,000-foot range. You probably know more. We're just starting to see those come into our service territory. Some, when we're largely a rural utility, except for population centers like here in the valley, if you get outside of here, we're largely a rural utility. So we have not had a lot of small cell wireless deployments, although I will tell you we are talking with a lot of providers right now. I mean, we have many contracts in the works. Yeah.
They might not understand distribution and transmission. You only let distribution poles joint use.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so under the regulations, investor-owned electric utilities are required to provide access to distribution poles. And distribution poles at Rocky Mountain Power are poles with only distribution facilities or poles with transmission and distribution underbuilt. And so, if you see a line of poles, particularly much taller than normal, much larger conductors, and much larger insulators, and that's all you see on those poles, those are transmission poles. They carry the high voltage lines between our substations or between our generation sites and our substations. When you get down into commercial areas or the neighborhoods, we step that voltage down into what's called the distribution voltage. And those are the poles, or those types of poles. Whenever you see distribution, like transformers and the kinds of electric conductors that provide service to your home, those are the poles that we have to allow access to.
Is it because of what is the reason for not letting them run the transmission line? Is it the voltage?
It's primarily safety. They're not designed for joint use. It's primarily safety. And then also the accounting on those poles is different as well. So just in terms of the cost of
Those poles also take care of many more customers that have transmission. They can't afford to let those poles have any damage.
Yeah, they're critical to the grid. Critical to the grid, yeah. Jim?
The Utah Commission had extensive rulemaking, and they established all the parameters to allow attachments and what the cost of recovery would be, things like that. The Commission had created that. But for the question about wireless, the Commission said wireless could attach, but the details of that have not really been resolved. We anticipate we're in negotiations with wireless providers, as is Rocky Mountain Power, that at some point we'll either reach an agreement that will have to be approved by the Public Service Commission, or if we don't reach an agreement, it will be arbitrated before the Commission. A lot of the disputes that may exist has to do with safety. Where you can allow equipment, for example, wireless wants to locate, obviously when you fly on the poles, they want to go on the top of the pole. Historically, communications, you had communication station on the pole, and you had power stations, and it stayed out of the power station. But I think the Commission is going to allow that. What we've got to do is figure out safe ways so we don't jeopardize the safety of personnel and structure of the pole as well.
I have a slide here from our standards, our engineering standards, and I put it in because I wanted to give you a sense of how space is allocated on a pole. Now, at the end of the day, positions of where attachments go are dictated by field conditions and engineering and what type of equipment. But this is a schematic of from our standards of a 45-foot pole and the space allocation. 45-foot pole is pretty standard for us in an urban area where you're likely to see multiple providers. You're likely to see us needing to have transformers and other equipment on the poles. Whereas when you get out in a more rural environment, particularly conductors that run from town to town, or out just on the outskirts of town, undeveloped parts, you're likely to see 40-foot poles. But when you have a 40-foot pole, I guess the point I want to make is there's a good portion of it that goes below ground here. In this case, 6'6" And then you have your safety clearance space from the ground to the first conductor. So that keeps all the conductors up high enough so that they don't get snagged by trucks or cars or anything else. And then you have several feet of space allocated for what we call the communications space. So you're going to have multiple opportunities for attachments in that space. And then you need to have this safety zone. It's called the communications worker safety zone. And it varies by the voltage that's above, but the typical space for a communications worker safety zone is 40 inches. So between the top communications attachment and the lowest power attachment, you have to have this free zone. called the Communications Worker Safety Zone. Nothing can go in there except a street light or a traffic signal wire because they perform a safety function. But that's really so that the communications worker can install and maintain the line and still have space, not come in contact with the electrical conductor. Right, right. You've seen those pictures. Yeah. So that's a typical space allocation, and it'll vary by field conditions and size of pole.
One other thing, can you be on both sides of the pole?
Well, both sides of the pole. Well, they call that boxing. That's a term that's called boxing. And depending on where you are, what jurisdiction, yes. State of Utah, you can box. But at Rocky Mountain Power, what we'd like to see is we'd like to see those attachments out on a cross arm. Because if they're out on a cross arm on both sides of the pole, then a worker can still ascend and descend the pole without having to climb over. So that boxing is a way of creating additional space on a pole.
Cable management, could you address that? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that they're not dangling cables to the ground and low and overloading?
Sure. So certainly we have some oversight, but the responsibility lies with each and every service provider. So each service provider is under the same exact requirements, and that's to install and maintain the lines for their life in compliance with the law. And the law here is the National Electrical Safety Code. And there are some additional requirements depending on where you're at, where there's even higher requirements. The National Electrical Safety Code is a minimum. Now we have inspection programs, and we try and find and coordinate the remediation on these safety issues, as do all of the providers. The providers are required to have safety inspection programs as well. And I see some familiar faces in the room, and I know that they do. So, yeah, it's a constant bit of effort.
A couple of years ago, when a brush fire went through and took out some of Rocky Mountain Power's poles, to what extent are you guys getting impacted by brush fires this year?
Well, I know that we have calls and teams working on that every single day. I'm not directly involved, but I see all the alerts come across my desk on intercompany communications. We have a pretty robust vegetation management program to mitigate that. We take special precautions in high fire danger zones. We even have even larger buffers around those conductors and those poles. But yeah, we're being impacted. I'm sure as all of the existing county entities. I want to make sure I keep us on time here. So I want to touch on regulations. Jim mentioned it as well. So joint use is regulated in most states by the FCC, but in about 20 states, and it may be more than that now, the states regulate pole attachment. Utah is one of those states. So at the federal level, you have the code that I referenced there, and a link to that. In Utah, they have the Utah Public Service Commission has their administrative code governing pole attachment. Wow. The states that self-certify, about 20 of them, they do look to the FCC for guidance in many cases and model their state regulations after the FCC. The thing I wanted to mention, there's a couple of things that are unique to Utah with respect to their regulations. So investor-owned utilities in the state of Utah, and that would include companies like CenturyLink, they must have commission-approved pole attachment contracts on file. And that doesn't preclude folks from negotiating an agreement, but after the agreements are negotiated and signed, they need to go to the commission for final approval. And that's also true for rates and fees. And that's unique to Utah. I'm not aware of any other state that requires that contracts be approved by the commission. In terms of rights of access to distribution poles, and this is true for the FCC and in the state of Utah. As a matter of fact, this is a quote right out of the Utah regulations. So who has rights of access to distribution poles? Public utilities, so that would be us, CenturyLink, some others, a wireless provider, cable television company, communications company, or other entity that provides information or telecommunications services. And so there's been a lot in the news over the last year about, which types of providers have rights of access. And it's been expanded. So if you're one of these, you have rights of access. If you're not, you may not be guaranteed rights of access to poles. I haven't seen a case, and I haven't seen a case. It's not in my time, so that's 7 years. What about you, Jim?
I think template agreements, there have been regulatory proceedings, quite extensive regulatory proceedings with that safe harbor template.
Yeah, and I was going to just touch on that now. Go ahead. Yeah.
Also, there's cities that have their own public services, Provo here, St. George, others. I've seen one power company that will not let any pole attachments. And it's a little difficult to work with. You guys are great.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, and we're open for business, and we have to be. Yeah, there's all kinds of different types of pole owners. There's investor-owned utilities, which are regulated by the FCC and states, and then there's municipals, co-ops, PUDs. They are to a lesser extent, in some cases not at all, so they don't have to necessarily.
How many providers could put stuff on a pole? Like, what's the of what?
3 is really common. The electric utility and then 3 others are really common. 5 is not that unusual in a urban setting. Think about the most I've seen is about 7. Yeah. So I wanted to touch on contracts. So contracts are a must-have. They're a requirement, precursor to a pole attachment. So you have to have an executed pole attachment contract with a pole owner. That's going to govern the relationship between the 2 parties. It's going to govern rates, fees, terms and conditions. There's going to be some things about your credit status. There's going to be things about security considerations, maybe posting bonds. As you might imagine, there's a lot of risk and cost associated with pole attachments, and the pole owners and others want to make sure, the parties want to make sure that they're covered. Insurance requirements, indemnification, all the legalese that goes into the contracts. Jim mentioned the safe harbor agreement. So I know that Rocky Mountain Power and CenturyLink both, because of the way we're regulated, we have to have a statement of generally available terms, an SGAT, filed and approved to the commission and available for attaching entities to use, and it's called the Safe Harbor Agreement. And I've provided a link to it so you know where to find it. So this was through a process, through a docket. These were contracts that the parties had input on of standard terms and a safe harbor agreement that's available, for attaching entities to sign. It's already approved by the commission. Alternatively, you could negotiate a contract with the pole attacher. And there are some pros and cons for both. So, for example, the safe harbor, if you're in a hurry, you don't have time to negotiate, take that one. It's already approved by the commission, you can go. Maybe one of the cons is you can't change it. So you have to take it as is. If there's something that you don't like about it, too bad, so sad, you can't get it changed. A negotiated agreement allows for some greater flexibility in terms, but it may take a while to negotiate, and it requires commission approval after the fact. And I mentioned that I haven't seen one not approved. But again, that takes usually from the time you file to the time you get it approved, takes about 45 days. So if you're in a hurry, you need to consider that.
I have a question. What would constitute an emergency?
Emergency in what context?
Well, you said that under the safe harbor agreement, you guys could, go ahead and have someone co-locate, and then after the fact, get the permission from the PSC, right?
Oh, okay. So, sorry, I didn't mean to. If that's what I said, I didn't mean to say that. No. In context, well, I don't know what would constitute an emergency with respect to needing a pole attachment agreement. But if you have an urgency, say you've got some funding, you need to get out and deploy your system, one of the fastest ways to get a pole attachment agreement with Rocky Mountain Power is to sign the safe harbor agreement. That one's already approved by the commission. It doesn't require any further approval. Alternatively, you could negotiate an agreement, and then the parties file it with the commission for approval. And that would take the negotiation time, whatever that is, and then about an extra 45 days. Your question was? Probably about 60 days would be the fastest you could get one done. And I'm going to talk a little bit about applications, and that's really why I say 60 days. Okay, I think I got that. How am I doing on time? I'm probably way over, right? Okay. Okay, and I want to make sure I allow time for more questions, too. Yeah, I gave you a lot of time. So here are some types of contracts that are available from Rocky Mountain Power, and I list these because I want folks to understand that not all contracts are the same. So I call this first one the licensee only. That means that you're an attaching entity that doesn't own poles. You're only going to be a renter on poles, and so it's a licensee only type of agreement. Alternatively, a reciprocal agreement means you're a pole owning entity, and Rocky Mountain Power and you are each going to attach to each other's poles, and so that's a reciprocal agreement. We have a wireless agreement. Those are very specific. They have a specific set of standards and some different things that are different considerations and provisions in them. So we have a wireless type of agreement. Then we have a pole-specific agreement. A pole-specific agreement is where you just really need to get from here to there, from this building to that building, and need to attach to about 7 poles. You're never going to attach to more than 7 poles. Then this is a much smaller, more condensed agreement that will cover just those poles and really no opportunity for expansion. But sometimes that's a really handy tool. So we have those 4 types of agreements. Plus, I mentioned we have the safe harbor agreement on file. Yeah. And we've just recently, and we're still finalizing our templates for small cell. I wanted to also tell you where our electric service schedule number 4 is at. I mentioned before, in Utah, any rental rate or fee that you charge, or that we charge, has to be approved by the commission, and then it's set in a tariff, and it stays that way. So our electric service schedule 4 is a publicly available document that will tell you what our rental rates and fees are for joint use. Okay, I mentioned you had to have a contract. You also have to have, the contract governs the relationship. You also have to have a permit to be on each pole. So I call that permitting, filing applications. So you must submit applications to attach to each pole. Those applications contain your engineering details, and in the state of Utah, there's a free-to-use system called Notify that you need to apply the permit through. And so that's a system that's approved for the application process in the state of Utah. Not only must you file an application, you must receive approval from the pole owner prior to attaching to any pole. And there are some cases where access can be denied. Access may be denied for insufficient capacity, safety, or engineering reasons. So what is that? So in the case of insufficient capacity, there may not be enough space, enough vertical space. There may not be enough strength. The owner can deny access for those reasons. Now, alternatively, the applicant can say, I'm willing to pay to increase the capacity on that pole, and then the owner can decide, give a price, and then the owner can decide to do that. Other considerations may be for safety or engineering. It's just not designed for joint use. Joint use just can't happen here for those reasons. There are very few times when access is denied and there's not a remedy. Typically, increasing capacity is a remedy for creating more space on a pole. Exceptions to prior approval, service drops. Service drops are the smaller wires that go from the poles to the buildings or the poles to the houses, and those can be placed and then the application submitted after the fact. And commissions recognize that the industry needs to serve its customer base, and there's a lower risk, not absent risk, but there's a lower risk of there being safety issues, or at least persisting safety issues with service drops. So what happens is, recognizing that you need to deliver service, you can go out and deliver service and file your application after the fact. But you have to do that. And then there's also an exception to an application and prior approval for overlashing. It may not be a well-known term, but overlashing is where you have an existing set of conductors, wires going down a pole line, and now you want to strap on more capacity, and that typically means you take and you'll add a fiber cable to the same bundle of wires, and that's called overlashing.
Strand, we put up, and then we lash to.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had a picture of that, but I don't. That'd be a good one to have also. Question?
Not a situation where you're moving one, another installation, so like for the copper cable off of the wall.
Yeah, we want to know about those, and typically we won't hold up that kind of work, but we would like to know, particularly if it's going to increase the loading on the pole. If it's going to stay the same or decrease it, we're less interested in that. We would like folks to take care of any issues at the time, like any clearance issues or anything like that. Okay, compliance. Nice lead in there. So I mentioned earlier that all companies must install and maintain attachments in compliance at all times. That means the day you put it in, 5 years from then, 10 years from then, 50 years from then. So you have to comply with the terms of the contract, the conditions of your approved permit, the National Electrical Safety Code, any federal, local, and state requirements. I know, for example, UDOT has, height requirements that far exceed the NESC for road crossings. And then, the pole owner is also allowed to dictate, certain standards that they need that might be above and beyond the National Electrical Safety Code. And that's forever. That's just not the day it goes up. So, some challenges,
So,
the
so
things that,
Jeff,
go ahead.
Jeff,
Yep.
this is Melissa with the Forest Service. So when you talk about federal, you know, of course I'm with the federal government. So when you talk about federal requirements, are you talking mostly like with FCC or, you know, what I'm getting at is what kind of compliance must you adhere to when your poles are located on federal land?
So there may be special conditions of the permit or the easement to be on federal lands that you would have to adhere to, for example. That would be one example that I could think of.
So, for example, if you are co-locating, which we fully support, that's, you know, as a federal entity, we're all about not having the proliferation of rights-of-way and infrastructure. But if you co-locate, if you have somebody that's co-locating on one of your poles, to what degree do you notify the federal entity?
So at Rocky Mountain Power, we require that the co-locator or the entity coming on have their own permission with whatever authority, whether it be a private property owner, a franchise, the federal government, the state government, that they have their own authority to be there, and that they can demonstrate that they have permission to be there. And then, once they do, then we would grant them permission to attach.
Mm-hmm.
You make it awfully hard for us to attach sometimes, all the stuff we have to go through.
Oh, that wasn't me.
I was going to say, who is that being directed to?
So these are the kind of the things that we struggle with and the things that we know the industry struggles with. So education and training, real broad topic, but a lot of times the contracts get negotiated and then they get filed in a drawer somewhere, and the parties don't go out and talk to the people involved in placing pole attachments about what the rules are, what the rules of engagement are. So contract provisions, joint use processes and systems. Folks are out there doing work and they haven't really been told, you know, who they need to talk to or what the processes are. So this education piece, both on what are the terms of the contract that I need to be doing this work under, and what are the processes I need to be following. That's a big one. And then we always want to make sure that we have current and active internal and external points of contact so that we can problem solve at the local level. My group is in Portland. We do a pretty good job of interfacing with folks around our 6-state territory, but there's nothing like having those local contacts and knowing who you're supposed to be working with. And then, of course, education on the National Electrical Safety Code. That's the law. That's the minimum standard for overhead line safety. I mentioned advanced planning. Nothing really happens very fast in joint use. So if you're thinking about deploying a system, you have to really think about planning ahead for things like contract negotiations, things like time for the commission to approve the negotiated contract, time frames for approval of applications to attach. So the minimum time frame, once you have a contract signed and approved, and you submit an application and everything is complete on that application, the minimum turnaround on that is 45 days. Now, it might happen soon. Sorry, that's the maximum. And that is going to depend on how many poles are on your application. when you read, the Utah state regulations and you read other state regulations, you'll see that there, and even in the federal regulations, there are thresholds. If you submit an application for 100 poles, to attach to 100 poles, you're likely to get that turned around in 45 days. But if you submit an application for 350 poles, then some extended time frames kick in, automatic thresholds. The pole owner gets more time, and it makes sense. Time frames for make-ready work. So poles aren't always just ready for you. So what's make-ready work? Make-ready work is the engineering and construction necessary to create the space or to make the pole ready for your attachment. And so there are time frames associated with that as well. You might get a cost estimate for what it's going to cost to get that pole ready. You need to approve those costs. That takes time. Get the cost approved, we need to get that in our schedule. And, you know, those are typically 45 days or longer, another 45 days. Time frames for construction, you need to allow plenty of time for your own construction. And then if your network, whatever network you're building requires power, you need to make a separate application through our customer service center for the power that you'll need. And not all systems do, but more and more they do. And so there's a whole electric service requirements process that you need to go through as well to get power. Yeah.
One other thing, and that is I really try and find out the local person. I go out with him, and we review and see which poles that I need, and I can get it a lot quicker if I know that person.
And that gets back to the establishing the local relationships and how important that is. Just a few more challenges. I can't say enough about this one. Coordination between existing attaching entities. Not only do you want to know who at the power company you need to work with, but you need to know and develop relationships with those other attaching entities on the pole, the phone company, the cable company, that other fiber provider, maybe your competitors. Because that's the way you'll get things done, and there's some mutual benefit there to having those relationships, particularly if you've got large projects, and you can help each other out. So once you get on the pole, that's not the end of it. And what we often see is folks don't really plan for the long haul. So you're going to have ongoing maintenance budget and resources that you're going to need to have to maintain that network over its life. So you're going to have poles that get replaced, roads that get widened, poles that go away, new poles, new businesses, new development. This causes a constant churn with your existing attachment. And you need to have the funding set aside and plan for that. And we see a lot of times providers get caught short in that area. You also need to fund an ongoing inspection and correction program. So that's part of it, part of being a responsible attacher. And then finally, pay your bills on time. So with Rocky Mountain Power, that's just one of the things you need to do. If you want to get on our bad side, don't pay your bills or be late, and that's bad. So just a couple of other slides left. I wanted to tell you how to reach us. I have a great team in Portland. We also have a manager here that right here in town that is responsible for our field inspection group. She's a wealth of knowledge. She can help you a lot. These are the email boxes that we use. Diana Winchester is our contract administrator. The best way to reach our contract group is through the joint use contract mailbox. Lisa Walker manages all of the permitting process and approval. Best way to reach her is through joint use of pacificcorp.com. Tammy Kaczmarek oversees the group that manages all the coordination of rearrangements. Once you're on the pole and you've been on the pole and poles need to be replaced, you can reach her. Mary MacArthur is our billing manager. And then Tori Bennett is local here. She's the manager of the field inspection group, and she has a team of employees in Utah and Wyoming and Idaho. There are eyes and ears in the field, and they can help a lot. And then finally, there's my contact information as well. And then I thought I'd put up this sheet with some additional resources. So I mentioned if you need power service from us, there's the link to our electric service requirements document. Also want to put in a little plug for the Western Energy Institute. They're a regional utility group, and they put on a joint use conference every year. There's a link to the details for this year's conference, which is the third week in September in Denver. And I've been involved in that conference. I can't go this year because I have a conflict. I'm going to be of a regulatory proceeding in Washington, but I have some folks going. It's a great conference. It's where pole owners and pole attachers get together. I've been going for the last 8 years, probably about 10 years. So take a look at that. Also be aware, part of the training, getting back to the training for your workers, be aware that OSHA has regulations for telecommunications workers and electric utility workers. Part of having them out there is they've got to be trained, and employers are responsible for doing that. And finally, I give a little plug for the Oregon Joint Use Association, a great resource, particularly a great training resource for the National Electrical Safety Code. Every spring, the Joint Use Association in Oregon puts on a big training seminar. They bring in a code expert. David Marn has been coming for the last several years. It's a 2-day conference. The Oregon Joint Use Association is unique. The Oregon legislature said, we've got to get an industry group, we've got to sponsor an industry group that can help work out all the issues and details and get rules and things like that in place. And so this association is made up of electric utilities, phone companies, cable television companies, telecommunications companies, small cities, PUDs, everybody and anybody that has anything to do with pole attachments benefits from this association in Oregon. There's not really any like it around. There's a joint pole group in Southern California that's kind of does some of the same functions, but anyway, I'd encourage you to take a look at these resources and particularly visit these websites. Do I have some time for some questions? Sure.
Jeff, Sharon Brewer.
Hi, Sharon.
I had a question about transitioning from overhead to underground. I do a lot of work with developers in the valley where the underground is mandatory, and just wondering if you could touch a little bit on how all of this applies to conduit underground.
So, one of the my department does not touch on the joint trench or underground conversions. That all happens at the local level within the district offices. Generally, with respect to conduit and renting space in conduit, I know that Rocky Mountain Power does not allow any joint use of its own conduit. That doesn't mean that the company doesn't work together with developers and other providers on undergrounding facilities or on new developments on what we call joint trench. But there's not a contract. There's not a rental agreement. So it all happens at the local level. I don't know a lot about it. I don't know a lot about how it happens or the mechanics of it. But if ever you're in need of getting a hold of someone who there's a project coming up and you need to know more, my department and I can get you in touch with them.
So when you switch a pole out or a pole front, you notify to let us know or to have their transfer.
Yeah, so notify is used for pole transfer notifications too. We have other mechanisms for that too. We do a lot of that via email as well. But in the state of Utah, Notify is the primary tool.
Get notified each week. There's some companies that don't go and do their job, but I still get those notified, it drives me nuts.
We talk to people a lot about setting up email rules, so a lot of those emails just go right into a different place. Other questions? Yeah, so we do perform post inspections, but not 100%. So we may not know right away that they happen. Again, the burden for installing and maintaining is actually on the company installing, but we do have inspection programs. We have post-construction inspection, but then we have periodic cyclical safety inspections. We might catch it then, and then notify the party that they need to remediate that. So it may not be right away. And
Also, you're talking, and follow up on his question, secondary poles, no distribution on top, that's the type of pole we can go ahead and do without a permission.
for a service drop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Service.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Could you
actually,
repeat that?
You could actually attach a service drop to any distribution pole. It doesn't have to be just what we call a service pole. Any distribution pole, you could make an attachment of a service drop and then submit the application after. Does the person on the line hear that?
Just barely, but that's okay.
Okay.
So we're assuming that you have,
So not exactly. So if the service drop is the first attachment, say, to the pole, you can still submit your application after the fact if it's a service drop. In some cases, if you have an existing presence and you're going to attach a service drop in the same space, you're not going to use extra space on the pole. You don't even have to submit an application. You just let us know. Just a notification. So with service drops, there's some special exceptions and rules that enable you to deploy service to customers quickly. Yeah.
Jeff, I've got a couple of questions. Okay, first, does Rocky Mountain Power own its own fiber, and does it run, in support of its operations, and does it run that on transmission lines?
It does own its own fiber, and I am presuming there is some on transmission lines. Yes.
So do you sublease excess capacity of that fiber?
We have a different department that handles it. It's called our communications group, and I don't know what the subleasing arrangements are, but if you have my contact information here.
I actually have asked this question.
Oh, have you?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, I've talked to them.
Oh, you know them? Okay.
They don't, and the
Okay.
reason why they don't is because they don't want to venture into the area of having to be a telecommunications provider, so they purposely stayed out of doing that.
So there's the answer. So no, we don't sublease.
Okay. So then my other question, of course, I'm the Forest Service here. you know, I suspect we don't have a lot of distribution poles on the Forest Service since it's large expanses of land, but there are some. So if somebody comes and wants to co-locate on your pole for whatever purpose, and you say, well, they have to get the permission from the landowner, the difficulty the Forest Service runs into is that we issue authorizations to the owner of the facilities that is on the land. So has Rocky Mountain Power encountered this anywhere where the Forest Service or another federal entity says, we're not going to issue a separate permit to this provider when they're co-locating on your pole. Rather, we're going to work with you to put in like a sublease clause into your authorization and hold you responsible? Have you encountered that anywhere?
You know, I've touched on it because I interact with our right-of-way group a fair amount, and we may have arrangements like that as well, where we're able to convey our rights to a third party to be on that property. It's rare, but I'm not saying it hasn't happened.
Okay. And I guess just the only final comment I would make is that, you know, again, we probably don't have that much in the way of distribution on the Forest Service, or maybe other federal lands. But when we do see co-location on a structure, that does require authorization with the federal government, either through a separate authorization or we have to work with Rocky Mountain Power or whoever the power company is to incorporate a sublease component into that authorization.
I would think so, yes.
So, no, I just wanted to make that statement for other members that are attending the meeting.
So the answer is that's what they're saying she's saying needs to happen. So yes.
Yeah.
Either Forest Service or BLM.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Really,
Thanks for the opportunity.
we've never covered this topic in advisory council meetings, for Service is great, and great to have, you know, somebody that we've met that people can follow up with, and we're happy to forward on his contact information. Do you have business cards? I do have. Yeah. Just pass them around. I think lots of people would like to.
Can I just tell you, the reason for 10 years I was on power lines for the Pacific Corp. And I've had experience with this in great detail with a lot of federal people in that. And they're great. They're awesome.
Okay. So, we're going to move on to Mount Vermont with Jessie. So yeah, she's going to take a few minutes to talk about it. And I'm actually really excited about this first map of the month. And I'm just going to lead into it a little bit. In a recent meeting, one of the things, we did our kind of workshop a few months ago, one of the questions that we got was, you know, I know that the DLM and the Forest Service have communication sites that are designated, but where are they? And so we haven't quite gotten the Forest Service sites yet, and I'm not sure what information that they have, but we were able to speak with the BLM, and they gave us their information from their database of where the communication sites for the BLM are located, and so they were able to give us townships and ranges. It was in a database, but it wasn't publicly mapped or available anywhere. So this is the first time that we've been able to see where they are. So now we have a layer of those BLM communication sites, which is a huge deal, and we're really grateful for the BLM for providing that to us so that we can map it. And we have this data layer, so if any providers are wanting to work with it more closely, with that, go ahead, Jesse.
That was really good. That's what I was going to say. So like Kelly said, we worked with the BLM to get information on where they have authorized communication sites. So there's not necessarily a tower here. It's just areas that they've authorized for the use of a tower. So for those familiar with the public land survey system, they use that grid system to designate areas that are authorized for towers. So it's basically the grid that goes from the biggest, which is township, range and section, I think. Section's the smallest one, and that's those squares.
they're small squares. So luckily, they had used that because those each have a unique identifier, and like Kelly said, this was in a tabular format. It wasn't mapped at all. So we took that data and we correlated it with our geographical representation for our map layer of those sections. So we were able to put it on a map. So the red is areas that are authorized for sections, and the yellow on this map is BLM land. So you can toggle it off and on. So it's all going to be on the yellow. You can also look to see all land ownership in Utah, which is kind of helpful to see what is, between. Green is Forest Service. To get to the legend, you're going to go up here. Legend, so National Forest, National Wilderness. So, we did talk quite a bit after our brainstorming last time about towers too, and we are in initial discussions about how to map actual tower locations. We're hoping to do it not based on an individual provider tower, so we're hoping just to have a data set of towers in general. Are there any questions about this? I'm pretty excited about it because this is the first time.
So yeah, hopefully, it's useful, and if there are other data sets that you think would be useful for us to collect kind of on behalf of industry and make publicly available, we're certainly willing to reach out to partners and try and see, they can either BLM and try and figure out where their locations are, because I think this information is useful to a lot of different groups.
Can you click on to one of them and get,
Oh, yeah.
Information? Is that what you have here?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Made this a couple months ago. Sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah, and this is a great example of something that was pretty easy to map, but just hadn't been mapped yet.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's public, it's on the,
Yeah, so if you go.
It's on the
Broadband.utah.gov. And if anyone wants the raw data, we can give it to you. Any other questions? It's interactive, so you can zoom in to any. No results. Wow. I think you have to actually type in the address. So. Any other questions?
It would have, tribal land on there and
Yeah.
land ownership. So that would be a big discussion with whether they would allow towers. Actually, that came up because they said, there's not a lot of new space and that's because there's a lot of tribal land.
Yeah, so this is just BLM.
Yeah,
this is just how they organize their land and how they designate their land. So the peach on here is tribal. There's quite a lot of land ownership, so it's kind of messy. So it's easier to turn it off and on, I think. So anything else? Okay. So our next map was, we were talking about how Utah often does really well in nationwide and even international studies on access to speed. So we kind of wanted to break that down and look at it nationwide. This was pretty fun. We got to make a map outside of Utah, which my coworker who did this said it's the second time we've ever got to do that. So that was exciting. So this shows the percentage of households, I'm pretty sure, that have access to different levels of speed per state. So this is 6. So this is a pretty low bar. And most states, if you notice, this actually starts at 90%. So most states are doing quite well when it gets to 6. But as you go higher in speed, states start to drop off. So you can see here, Utah automatically starts to stand out at 25 megabits per second down. This is maximum advertised residential speed. 100. Yeah, I found this very interesting. I spent a long time going through this. This is kind of a fun one to go through, things that you wouldn't expect. Like, I had no idea Vermont. Yeah, Maine. I didn't realize that, yeah, maybe we need to fire that on already. So first, if you wanna start that thing. And this is, the last one's upload, and we just did one upload at 10, so you guys did it pretty well. So was our neighbor.